Respondents were asked
You are now muted.
based on the extent it met all of the following criteria. So it needed to be serious, which means a high risk that the event would cause serious harm or death, and serious harm being a significant permanent change in the ability of patients to function as they did before the event. It needed to be recurring, so that the event would be likely to happen to another patient if we didn't do something to address it. It needed to be identifiable, that the event was easily recognized, clearly defined, and not attributable to other possible causes, and it needed to be avoidable. Appropriate organizational barriers that will prevent the event from occurring again. So were they in place, or could they be in place? The Never Events Action Team concluded with the following list of 15 never events for hospital care in Canada. So surgery on the wrong body part or patient, wrong procedure, the wrong tissue, biological implant, blood product, unintended foreign body left in the patient, patient death, serious harm from improperly sterilized instruments or equipment, patient death, serious harm from allergies, failure to inquire or adhere to, patient death from serious harm from wrong gas, patient death from serious harm from 5 pharma events, which included wrong route chemo, IV administration of concentrated potassium solution, injection of epinephrine intended for topical use, wrong concentration of hydromorphone, neuromuscular blockade without sedation, airway, or ventilation. Failure to identify metabolic disturbances such as hypoglycemia and hyperbilirubinemia, stage 3 or 4 pressure ulcers following admission, uncontrolled movement of magnetic object in MRI, patient death or serious harm from accidental burn, patient elopement who are under the highest level of observation, patient suicide, patients who are under the highest level of observation, infants abducted or discharged to the wrong person, and not leaving frail patient or patient with dementia in safe environments, so regarding patient transport. This list is a call to action for us. We know some facilities are taking action to measure their never events, which is fabulous. In addition, the hospital harm measure allows some possible ways to further collect data on never events. So Kai will now explain this in more detail in their presentation. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's Jason Thompson here from CPSI. I'm just going to step in. I believe we have Carola on the line now, so I'd like to invite her to give her presentation, and then we'll proceed with David and Tracy from Kai. Carola, if you're there, the floor is yours.
You are no longer muted.
Thank you to Patients for Patient Safety Canada and CPSI, and to all of you for allowing me to share my son's story. There are some things that should never happen during hospital stays, and my son's event is one of them. You could change the slide. This is my youngest son, Nicholas. He was born November 26, 1994, at 8 pounds 6 ounces. He was born with a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, an extra electrical pathway in his heart. So this was my son's heart rate for most of his life. But in April 2010, when Nicholas was 15, he left school sick, arriving in emergency with a heart rate of 180. The emergency doctor managed to convert his heart back to normal rhythm with medications, and 3 weeks later he was scheduled for a cardiac ablation at BC Children's Hospital. You could forward the slide again. Nick's extra pathway was in the area where the purple arrow is. The blue arrow indicates where my son was injured, the top of the right atrium. His procedure was done in a cardiac cath lab, and although they may have emergency equipment close by, this is certainly not an operating room. 4 catheters were fed into Nicholas's heart via his femoral artery, and a pacing catheter was in situ at the top of the right atrium. It had 4 metal tips that at one time was a single-use catheter. Nicholas was the 4th patient it had been used on. This next bit of information may seem off track, but I promise it will come to full circle. The reprocessing issue was not even on my mind at the time of my son's event, obviously, but I would like to share this information that I discovered. In 2010, critical single-use reprocessed medical devices had no oversight by Health Canada. Reporting was therefore voluntary. The provinces had full ownership of these devices and could do what they wanted with them after its first use. some provinces decided to utilize the single-use device reprocessing system in the states and send their used devices to them, buying them back at a much cheaper cost. However, in the states, the reporting was mandatory, and yet strangely, 3 months after Nick's horrific moment, I could not find a report on the FDA MedWatch system. I reported it, which resulted in phone calls from the FDA, and incredibly, this company had closed their investigation the next day and had deemed it unreportable. It made me absolutely furious remembering all that Nick had went through that day. If you could forward the slide. On that day in April, when I left Nicholas in the cath lab, the staff told me it would take about 4 hours. When I came back, a very concerned-looking nurse was waiting for me and asked if I had anyone with me. I knew then something was terribly wrong. She advised me that they're working on him. I was brought to the cardiologist who had advised me that my Nicholas had been taken to the operating room. Apparently, during the cardioversion, an arcing occurred unbeknownst to the doctors. Therefore, after the ablation, his heart was still tachycardic, and a stat ultrasound confirmed he had cardiac tamponade and was deteriorating rapidly. The surgical team was brought in, and Nicholas had no palpable pulses for approximately 2 minutes. CPR was continued. When the situation became dire after failed pericardiocentesis, a surgical team was brought in to laparoscopically view the ventricles of his heart, lacerating his liver and diaphragm, making a pericardial window in his heart sac. Nicholas continued to bleed and received a total of 2 units of blood. The staff ended up having to do an emergency sternotomy, opening up his chest to save his life in the cath lab. But due to the insufficient lighting there, they had to bring him to the OR opened up. He was found to have a 4-millimeter hole burned through the top of his right atrium, alongside 3 other burns that had not burned through. He ended up in ICU on a ventilator, kept hypothermic, and discharged 6 days later, thanks to the heroic efforts by the staff there. This journey has been extremely frustrating, disbelieving, but hopeful. A lack of reporting is a waste of knowledge. The fear of lawsuits influences transparency. To be able to have a reporting system that does not point fingers but tracks events to learn from them in an almost seamless way is promising. I'm a full supporter of this endeavor because the lack of reporting in my son's Never Should Have Happened event would have been captured in the never event statistics. Today, my son is in his 4th year heavy-duty mechanic apprenticeship program. He is fit, healthy, and has turned into a productive member of society that we are all very proud of. Again, thank you everyone for taking the time today to listen to our story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carola, for sharing your story with us today. I know that CPSI will be investing efforts in medical device failure this year, and I know that you'll be an instrumental part of that work as well. We'll now throw things over to David O'Toole and Tracy Johnson, the team at Canadian Institute for Health Information, for the next part of today's webinar.
Thank you very much. This is Tracy Johnson here. David O'Toole is on the line, but he's having audio issues, so I'm going to present right on through today. Providing Canada's health system with information to support the delivery of high-quality, safe care has always been at the heart of what we do at the Canadian Institute for Health Information, or CIHI. When CIHI and CPS
You are now muted.
collaborating on the Hospital Harm Project 5 years ago, the goal was to improve gaps in patient safety measurement and information in Canada. We reached a significant milestone when we released the Hospital Harm Report and Improvement Resource in 2016. Today, I will talk about the Hospital Harm Measure and how the list of never events compares to what's captured in the Hospital Harm data. I want to put in a plug for CIHI's new resource outlining the rigorous process we go through to develop indicators like the ones we're talking about today. We're frequently asked and frequently consulted about our indicator development process. This resource is valuable to CIHI and can be referenced by anyone interested in indicator development. I recommend visiting our website if you're at all interested in this work. So what exactly is the Hospital Harm Measure? To start, I'll provide some background. The Hospital Harm Measure was designed to provide a standard approach to measuring and monitoring harm that can happen to patients while in hospital. It complements other data collection efforts related to patient safety from CIHI and other organizations like CPSI and Health Quality Ontario. The measure is defined as the rate of acute care hospitalizations with at least one occurrence of unintended harm that could have potentially been prevented by implementing known evidence-informed practices. For an event to be captured within the hospital harm data, it must have occurred after admission and required treatment or prolonged the hospital stay. It also has to fall into one of 31 clinical groups or types of harm determined by experts to be associated with evidence-informed practices. The measure is broken down into 4 categories of harmful events, and these 31 clinical groups or types of harm are contained within these 4 larger categories. The 31 types of harm have common actions or evidence-informed practices. Let's quickly review the 4 categories. The first category, called healthcare or medication-associated conditions, includes events related to general care or medication administration during a hospital stay. Pressure ulcers or obstetric trauma fall into this category. The second, healthcare-associated infections, are infections, again, that occur during a hospital stay, including those related to or following a medical or surgical procedure. Things like urinary tract infections, pneumonia, and blood infections such as sepsis are examples of these. Then we have patient accidents, which include in-hospital injuries like fractures, dislocations, and burns. These events are not directly related to medical or surgical care, but occur because of the patient being in a particular situation in a hospital. And the fourth category, procedure-associated conditions, include harm associated with procedures, such as obstetrical trauma with instruments and retained foreign body. To understand how the hospital harm measure aligns with the never events list, it is important to understand where the data behind the measure came from. The foundation of the hospital harm data is the Discharge Abstract Database, also called the DAD, which is housed here at CIHI. The DAD contains records for every acute hospital stay in Canada. Hospitals regularly submit this data to us, taken directly from physician's notes on a patient's chart. The physician's notes are translated into diagnosis and intervention codes, which capture the conditions that a patient had and any treatment they received during their hospital stay. Because of the way the data is captured in the DAD, not all never events will be captured by the hospital harm measure. As an example, some never events mention a failure to follow protocols, which would not be identified by the DAD data. It is also important to note some of the other limitations of the hospital harm measure. Because it's based on diagnoses and interventions, it does not capture near misses, cases where a patient could have been harmed but wasn't because care providers intervened. The hospital harm data also won't capture never events where harm went undetected during the hospital stay but was discovered on a later visit or admission. An example of this is if an object is left in a patient after surgery but wasn't detected until after discharge, this would fall outside the capture for the hospital harm measure. To be captured by the hospital harm data, an event has to have occurred and been treated in the same hospital stay. This means that harm to patients who were not treated in acute care, such as those treated in the emergency department or rehabilitation, would also not be captured. So with those larger caveats in mind, let's have a look at where the never events are captured in the hospital harm data. Of the 15 never events on the list, 11 are captured either completely or partially by the hospital harm measure. These 11 can be found in the 9 clinical groups circled on this slide. The never event entitled Unintended Foreign Object Left in a Patient is a direct match to the hospital harm clinical group called Retained Foreign Body. This is when a sponge or other surgical tool is left in a patient after surgery. Other never events on the list are either fully captured as part of a clinical group or are partially captured within one or more groups. Examples of never events that are captured as part of one clinical group include surgery on the wrong body part or wrong patient, and serious harm arising from the use of improperly sterilized equipment, which are both captured as part of the selected serious events clinical group. However, this group also includes other types of events like an endotracheal tube that was wrongly placed during an anesthetic procedure. All stages of pressure ulcers are also captured by the hospital harm measure, while only stage 3 or 4 pressure ulcers are considered never events. Serious harm due to the administration of wrong inhalation or insufflation gas could be found in the medication incidence group. This group also contains other events of poisoning by drugs and biological substances. The next set of never events are ones that are only partially captured within the hospital harm measure. With respect to serious harm resulting from a failure to treat a metabolic disturbance, the hospital harm data captures hypoglycemic complications, which can be found in the hypoglycemia clinical group within the medication-associated category. Other metabolic disturbances, however, would not be captured. Some of the 5 pharmaceutical never events identified may be captured within multiple clinical groups. Events that are coded as poisoning by drugs or biological substances will be found in the medication incident or infusion, transfusion, and injection complication clinical groups. Others may be captured under the clinical group electrolyte and fluid imbalances. The documentation of harm is the limiting factor in our last example. In order for the never event, wrong tissue, biological implant, or blood product to be captured within the data, it would have to be coded as resulting in harm, meaning the patient required treatment within the same hospital stay. These events would be found in the infusion, transfusion, and injection complications clinical group. However, this group will also include cases where a patient experienced a complication from the delivery of the same kinds of products, such as correct tissue, implant, or blood product. Another group of never events are associated with patient trauma. As you can see from this slide, there are 2 clinical groups within the hospital harm measure called patient trauma. One is related to trauma that's associated with a procedure, so the far right-hand column, which you can see circled under the category, under that particular category. The second, which is the only clinical group under the category called patient accidents, captures patient trauma that is not procedure-related. If we look next at the never events associated with patient trauma, the never event serious harm due to an accidental burn could be captured in either of the patient trauma clinical groups, depending on whether it was associated with a procedure or not. However, it's important to note that these clinical groups would also capture other types of trauma, such as an injury from a fall. The never event serious harm that occurs during the transportation of a frail person or a patient with dementia would be captured under the patient accident category. Again, it's important to remember that administrative data does not provide information on whether protocols were followed. This clinical group will also include similar events for patients who do not have dementia or are not frail. In the case of serious harm due to uncontrolled movement of a ferromagnetic object in an MRI area, the events will be captured under the procedure-associated patient trauma group as long as the MRI was performed during the hospital stay. The remaining 4 never events are not captured in the hospital harm data, as these never events primarily relate to actions or protocols that were not followed. As you can see, the hospital harm measure captures more patient safety events than just never events, and there are some never events that are not captured in the harm data. Of the 15 total never events, 1 is a direct match, while others are either captured within a broader group or only partially captured. I hope this presentation has been useful as you try to understand what information is available from the hospital harm measure. And I'll hand it over to Anne.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Anna with Health Quality Ontario, over to you.
Thank you very much for the chance to present, and I'm pleased to be able to co-host this with CPSI and with CIHI and represent Health Quality Ontario. I do want to just start by offering apologies on behalf of Joshua Tepper, who was called away unexpectedly right before this presentation. So he does want to offer his sincere apologies, but I'm pleased to be able to step in. And also just to offer some reflections on the implications of putting this type of data, the never events, the harm that we measure into practice. And I'd want to say thank you to my fellow presenters, Chris Power and to Tracy, for laying out the components of both the never events, the process, what was come up with, and also the hospital harm indicator. But thank you in particular to Carola, who I think by sharing her and Nicholas's story just maps out why we're all here and why we're interested in this and highlighting that. So thank you. So the next slide, please. And the next slide. So I'd like to start with a bit of context and to introduce the various ways that Health Quality Ontario has shone a light on the issue of harm in hospitals and hospital patient safety. And the first is through our public reporting, and that we publicly report on patient safety in hospitals, and we have key indicators that call out the underlying elements of the CIHI hospital harm indicator. And as Tracy noted, this in itself, that indicator in itself embeds the never events. We also run a large quality improvement program in which over 1,000 facilities across Ontario, including all the hospitals in Ontario, develop and make public a comprehensive plan and commitment on an annual basis for how they are going to look at improvement against key indicators. And one of the things that's emerged since we did this joint work on never events is that our analysis of quality improvement plans in hospitals is showing that local facilities are electing to select never events as a priority. And so this is, I think, very hopeful in terms of advancing patient safety and the work that we're trying to do together. And then lastly, we convene a large provincial quality improvement network in surgery, which is based on the data through the National Surgical Quality Improvement Program in the U.S. And this has a focus on improving surgical outcomes and reducing harm, and in particular highlights morbidity and mortality within 30 days of before surgery, during surgery, and then within 30 days of discharge from surgery. And we are taking steps to move this into public reporting. So all three of these are at various stages of transparency in terms of shining a light on harm. The next slide, please. It's also important to recognize the limits of what we currently do and the limits of the Never Events Initiative, and to think about opportunities. So the first is that we, at least at Health Quality Ontario, and I think all three of our organizations, really do have a mandate to look across sectors, not just in hospitals. And so there's an opportunity to think about harm and events in hospitals, but also to look beyond hospitals, what happens in the community. And we also are very cognizant, I think Tracy's presentation showed there are times when you want to distinctly understand what was inside the hospital, but also to understand harm that happens beyond, and to monitor that. The other issue is that there are limitations, as Tracy's presentation highlighted, in terms of what is possible to routinely record in these events across hospitals in Ontario, but also across Canada and around the world, and some of the limitations that I think you spelled out really nicely, Tracy, of monitoring these and being able to interpret them once we do monitor them. The third point is that they are rare, and of course we're happy that they're rare, but it's also a question of how many resources we put towards monitoring rare events. I think we Carola and Nicholas's story highlight how critically important this is, but we do have to think about what we're going to do with them if we invest those resources, and that's sort of the nature of the rest of the talk. But then also to think about always events. The flip side being actions that would ensure optimal patient experience and improved outcomes. And this is something that we are working closely with the partners in this webinar to think about where to go next in this important work. So next I want to address 3 thoughts and reflections about quality improvement and the link to the issue of harm. So the first is that data and indicators are just the start. I think that's obvious probably to many people on this webinar, if not everyone. And we obviously start by trying to turn the data that we talked about and these indicators into interpretable, meaningful information. And of course, we tend to find when we're doing that what some of the quality issues are with the data. But assuming we do get to a point of routine reporting, we then need to think about what happens then. And this knowledge component is about knowing the support that may be needed on the front line and in local facilities for people who have responsibility for quality improvement about how to change. And this includes improvement and implementation science, and hopefully to be able to give a sense of what should be done from the evidence. But it also means that when we are confronted with serious events, that we understand how to do root cause analysis and investigations with a framing of a just culture. And I was really pleased to hear Carola talk about this no-blame culture that would be needed so that patients like Nicholas don't have to experience the events that he did. And then if we expect change to happen on the front line based on what we report, we need to ensure sufficient leadership capacity as well as leaders who are willing to champion the change management that's needed that would lead to improvement. And it's this whole cycle that needs to be contemplated from the moment we set out to select quality metrics for the purpose of improvement. That point that I made about deciding to invest in reporting means we need to follow through this whole cycle so that it's worth it, that we actually are able and have the capacity to act on it. So the next slide, looking at a second reflection, is that we need to be mindful of what many of us know as the innovation cycle. And the likelihood that the audience who have come to this webinar and others who have come to other events where we've highlighted never events and reducing harm are likely on that far left of this cycle, the innovators and the early adopters. And the challenge we all know, and this comes back to my previous reference to leadership capacity and change management, is that how are we going to capture the hearts and minds of those who aren't already on the left of this diagram? And if we think about improvement campaigns like Choosing Wisely Canada or the 100,000 Lives campaign, we see this wraparound approach to highlighting the importance and the critical need for this data and for acting on it, and the methods needed to not only change and lead to improvement, but also just to changing the hearts and minds of those who have the ability to make change on the front line and cross this chasm you see here to the early majority. And then for the final reflection I'd like to make on the next slide is, again, I want to say a thank you to Carola and for sharing yours and Nicholas's story. I think this is why we've all engaged in this work, and this is fundamental to keep in mind the patients who are affected by this potential harm and for whom we never want some of these events to happen. I also want to highlight that when we focus on harm and patient safety and the reporting of data, it can be easy to forget, important never to forget the patients, but it can also be easy to forget the 1 in 7 staff for whom a patient safety event has resulted in anxiety, depression, and concerns about their ability to simply continue in their role once an event has happened. And on the next slide, I want to highlight the next sentence of this quote, which is that an alarming 68%, nearly 70% of these clinicians reported that they didn't receive institutional support. So as we embark on and embrace the need to reduce harm and improve safety, we also have to consider the supports that are needed and be prepared to offer to frontline professionals, not only to have the science, the capacity, the leadership to prevent harm, but also that when we are confronted with a serious incident, that there's an ability to also support the depression and concerns and ability to perform in one's job, and the need to support the second victim of these events and on the front line. So thank you very much for the ability to present and for the opportunity to co-host with these partners.
Thank you very much, Anna. That brings us to the conclusion of our presentations, but we have had a few questions float through the chat box. If there's one that comes to mind for you and you want to enter it and send it over to us, that'd be great. But we'll just proceed with what we've got so far. The first one actually isn't even a question. There's someone who wanted to say that they found the information posted about health and patient safety from LinkedIn, from CIHI's LinkedIn. Is a very useful resource that they frequently reference. So a little bit of a plug there for anyone who's looking for health and patient safety information. We do have a question for Tracy. One person was wondering, are Quebec's events captured in with the hospital harm measure?
Thank you, Patrick. No, Quebec's harm events are not included in the hospital harm measure. In the rest of the country, we have the ability to understand the timing of some of the diagnosis and intervention codes, and in Quebec, we do not have the ability to understand timing, so we can't tell whether it was an in-hospital event or whether the patient, in a number of cases, came in with that diagnosis.
Thank you, Tracy. The next question can be for any one of our presenters. They ask, did the Never events influence the identification of hospital harm measures, or did these simply align naturally? Chris, Tracy, or Anna, are there any thoughts or insights to that question?
Jason, sorry, it's Tracy. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, they ask, did the Never events influence the identification of hospital harm measures, or did these simply align naturally?
Oh, so I can start an answer to that question. When we started developing the hospital harm measure 5 years ago, we started with a very large bucket, which was events, just complications and things that happened to patients in the hospital that you wouldn't want to have happen to you. And over time, we pared that down with expert advice and the Canadian Patient Safety Institute's help to events that are connected to evidence-informed practices. And Never events are very definitely connected to evidence-informed practices. So as a natural consequence of the larger bucket we were looking at, many of them were included in this.
And I can say from Health Quality Ontario, in our process to select the measures that we publicly report at a system level for hospital patient safety, we explicitly took the Never events as one component of measures that we looked at. So it was not an organic alignment. We looked at that as one family of measures when we considered all.
Great, thank you very much. The last question that we have for today is from someone who's at a hospital who's looking to use the hospital harm indicator to track some of the Never events, and they're looking for more information in terms of how they could do that. Specifically, where would they find their numbers? How often are they able to get them? Is it a monthly, quarterly, annually?
So that's a great question. So hospitals can look at their data in CIHI's preview tool, and we will be updating the data in February of this year, so in just a month. and it will have an updated methodology with minor changes that we've garnered from stakeholder feedback since its release. And 3 years of data will be available to support looking at trends over time.
Great, thank you very much. Final question has come in through the chat box just now. What are the panelists' thoughts on national public reporting of never events? For example, what's currently being done in provinces such as Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia?
So this is Chris. I'll take a stab at that from a CPSI's perspective. We think this is an absolutely important thing to do. This is all about transparency. It's something that we certainly are promoting and are having conversations with all of the provinces around the never events and seeing if we can get them to begin publicly reporting. So we have a few provinces who've taken the lead and have been those early adopters, which is fabulous, and hoping that all of the provinces and territories follow suit.
And it's Tracy. From a CIHI perspective, our mandate is to help improve the health of Canadians and the health system in Canada. So we publicly report a number of patient safety indicators. And this is a hospital harm measure is a new measure, so we're still working on that. But we would concur with Chris and CPSI, as well as Health Quality Ontario, that reporting, public reporting, is very important to help galvanize transformation.
Yeah, and I would agree. It's Anna. I think part of the question is about the public reporting, and part of the question is also about the national. And I would just support that it would be important to have a national effort too. And I think this is why you see the 3 partners co-hosting this today. And that we set out to embark on this work partly because we're thinking carefully about what should be publicly reported, and this transparency point that Chris made, we absolutely think this is important.
All right, thank you very much. Karina, could you advance the slide, please? All right, so when everyone logs off the call today, you'll be asked to take a very brief survey. Your feedback is instrumental, as we're always working to improve the webinars that we provide. So please do take a few minutes to do that. And advance again, please, Karina. The links were posted into the chat box, but in case you missed them, links for the hospital harm and never events are there. You can also visit patientsafetyinstitute.ca, and if into the search bar enter never events, the very first result will be that tool, and hospital harm, the very first result that will be pulled will be that tool as well. So you can find those there, and our email addresses are all on this slide that you can use to contact us if you have any other questions. Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to all of the participants. And just one final reminder that this webinar was recorded, and we'll be posting it to patientsafetyinstitute.ca along with the slides as soon as we can. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.